Hello and welcome to another session of Karen's Colours. I'm Dr. Karen and these are my colour conversations. This week, as you can see from the background, we're going to be delving into another film. And this time it's a comedy, comes out of 1993 and it's called Mrs. Doubtfire. It's a fairly long comedy, much more so than most, which usually come in at about 90 minutes. This one runs for over 2 hours. And it's quite a complex story and it involves a lot of colour analysis. So I hope you'll stay with me and enjoy. If you haven't seen the film, I highly recommend it. But I doubt if there are many people today who've not seen this wonderful film starring Robin Williams. Before I begin, though, I'd like to once again welcome those of you who've been following these videos. I greatly appreciate the fact that you actually spend some of your valuable time in watching what I have to offer. I hope you've been enjoying them. And certainly I welcome comments. I welcome suggestions for more films to review. And I also welcome those little ticks at the bottom that say that, yes, you've liked the film. You might even decide to subscribe. That would be a pleasant surprise. Thank you. If you're new to this channel, you're doubly welcome. I hope you find something here that is of interest to you, and perhaps you might even learn something. Anyway, let's get started. Firstly, cross-dressing films are considered to be comedies if the cross-dressing happens to be male to female. If it's a female to male cross-dresser, then that film is generally regarded as a drama. So Mrs. Doubtfire falls into the first category. They usually involve some sort of object lesson for women. They demonstrate that a male can be the ideal woman. And in that case, Mrs. Doubtfire is no exception. She does do some things that are definitely not done by most women, but at the same time, she is showing to the audience that she is the ideal grandmotherly type. One of the features of such films is that women are accepting of these cross-dressed women. They seem to be oblivious to the ruse itself, and they are quite accepting of the femininity type that is displayed by the cross-dresser. Males, on the other hand, are usually confused or become aggressive, or both, when the ruse is discovered, as it inevitably is. Let's begin now, as I usually do, with the plot line. I'll go through it and then we'll review the colours that have been displayed in the costumes. And because this is such a long film and it is rather complex, I'll be focusing only on the primary character. I will not be discussing any of the colour costume changes of the secondary characters. So here we begin with Daniel Hillard. He's a voiceover artist and he loses his job because he has an altercation with the boss and walks out. He is, however, a very devoted dad to 3 children, Lydia, who is 14 years old, Chris, who is just turned 12, and Natalie, who is 5. Daniel creates a rather chaotic birthday party for Chris at their home and is found out when wife Miranda arrives, is most upset and throws him out. In the court session that follows, Miranda gains custody of the children and Daniel is permitted weekend visits only. He's not very happy about this. We next see a distraught Daniel who's moved in with his gay brother. He applies for a job, and at the same time, Miranda is approached by an old flame, Stu, who gives her a commission for her architectural work. Daniel has the children for the weekend, and his visitation times are interrupted by Miranda, who is not impressed with Daniel's housekeeping. In the process, Daniel discovers that Miranda is looking for a housekeeper, so he disrupts that search by changing the phone number and then imitating various different people in order to obtain the job for himself. His brother and his brother's partner allow Daniel to undergo various iterations of alternative characters that he could be in order to take that housekeeping job. Some of the characters are good, some of them not so nice. But the final persona is not shown to us, the audience, until later in the film. All we see here is a back view. The persona of Mrs. Doubtfire arrives at Miranda's door and obtains that housekeeper position. There is drama in Mrs. Doubtfire's adjusting to her bodysuit, particularly when the social worker comes in to inspect the place that Daniel is living in order to approve it for visitation rights. There is a lot of switching backwards and forwards between Daniel and Mrs. Doubtfire roles in order to impress this lady. Daniel now, as Mrs. Doubtfire, begins to take over childcare. There is a standoff with the children. They're not impressed with Mrs. Doubtfire's demands, and Lydia in particular defies Mrs. Doubtfire. Nevertheless, Mrs. Doubtfire prevails. There is a cooking disaster that follows while the children are doing their homework, as Mrs. Doubtfire discovers that she really doesn't know how to cook. Nevertheless, she finds food from a delivery service and sets up a beautiful-looking table, which very much impresses Miranda. Lydia, afterwards, follows Mrs. Doubtfire out and apologizes for her previous behavior. We now see Mrs. Doubtfire evolving into the housekeeper role, dancing away as she does the vacuuming. Back home, Daniel is learning how to cook, and on one occasion he watches as Stu brings Miranda back home from an outing and gives her a goodnight kiss. Stu becomes a hit with the children because of his nature and also because of his ability to entertain. Mrs. D, of course, shows a great deal of disapproval. But somewhere along the line, young Chris discovers that Mrs. D is not a she, but a he, and he is most upset by this. Nevertheless, Lydia and Chris agree to keep Mrs. D's secret once they have discovered that she is indeed their father. Later on, Miranda confides in Mrs. D about her relationship with Daniel, and Mrs. D almost gives the game away because she understands that these are the issues that she had never even noticed before while she was in the persona of Daniel. At work, Daniel watches a children's show that has gone past its use-by date and makes some disparaging comments about it to the man standing next to him, who turns out to be his boss. Mrs. D is invited on an outing to a spa resort with the family that is being hosted by Stu. She doesn't like what she sees. She becomes drunk and jealous and assaults Stu with a piece of fruit. Next, we see Daniel playing with the toys on the set of the now defunct children's show. He's being watched by the studio boss, who is rather impressed and offers him a dinner evening where they can discuss Daniel's ideas. In the meantime, the children are quite pleased with Daniel's culinary skills, as is Miranda with his housekeeping skills, and we can see that Daniel himself becomes rather pleased about the praise he is receiving. Miranda insists that Mrs. D accompany the family to her birthday dinner that is being hosted by Stu. Mrs. D is invited to give advice about a dress and quite cattily suggests to Miranda that she should wear something quite staid and old-fashioned. But the problem is that the dinner coincides with the dinner date for the studio boss. And so Daniel goes to the secretary and asks to have that appointment changed, but this is to no avail. So off they go to the At the dinner, Stu gifts Miranda a beautiful necklace, and she's quite excited about it. Mrs. D, unfortunately, is not so happy about the gift. But now the studio boss arrives at the same restaurant, and we find Mrs. D desperately changing from one persona to another in the ladies' bathroom. The boss plies Daniel with lots of whiskey as they begin to bond, and in the process of backwards and forwards, eventually Mrs. D loses her teeth into her glass of wine back at the birthday table. Taking the opportunity that is offered by an open door to the kitchen, Mrs. D dons a chef's jacket, slips into the kitchen, and sabotages Stu's meal. When she returns to the boss's table, she has forgotten to change back into Daniel, and he is quite confused about this. While they're discussing why it is that he is now Mrs. D and not Daniel, Stu has an allergic reaction to the now sabotaged meal. Mrs. D, realizing what she's done, rushes to the rescue, and in the process, the charade becomes undone. After Miranda storms out, Daniel, now exposed, apologizes to Stu, they shake hands and then depart. Which brings Daniel and Miranda back to court. The judge is not impressed with Daniel's explanations and so awards custody of the children to Miranda, and Daniel is only permitted supervised visits. The children become very resentful of Miranda's continued search for a housekeeper, and on one of these occasions they overhear a familiar sound and realize that Mrs. D is now on television hosting a children's show. The show has become quite a hit, and at one stage Miranda goes to the studio to visit Daniel and watches as the studio boss is enraptured by Daniel's performance. She makes Daniel an offer about childcare, and the children are delighted to have their father back, and that is the end of the film. Let's now go into the analysis. I'm going to analyze these as two separate groups. Daniel's colours, firstly, and then I will analyze Mrs. Doubtfire's colours. But before we get started into this, we need to discuss a few ideas that come up with this analysis. Daniel is a far more colourful character in terms of costume colour than is Mrs. Doubtfire. There is a wider latitude of colour in costumes in comedy anyway, which means that the colours indicate a lack of seriousness in the roles. This is exemplified by Daniel's colours, but since Mrs. Doubtfire's persona is supposed to be more serious, her colours are quite muted. The presence of a male-to-female characterization by Mrs. Doubtfire is considered by most people of the time to be sufficient cause for the comedic element without Mrs. Doubtfire having to engage in any actual comedic activities. But because she is portrayed as an aging lady, her clothes are restricted to age-appropriate colours and also styles. Now I'm going to examine these colours in the order of frequency in which they occur, so they will not be in the order in which I've just presented them according to the plot. The most frequent colour we see on the persona of Daniel is white. It appears in 9 separate occasions. Firstly, we see the face view of Daniel with a white undershirt as he is performing his voiceover activities. He's wearing white trousers as he collects his children from school, and he also has those same white trousers on the first visit of his children to his now new apartment. He's also clad in white in the bathtub scene where he rings Miranda in an effort to convince her that he is somebody else applying for the housekeeper job. He's wearing a cardigan in the second disguise that he wears while his brother is trying to recreate him as someone different. And he's also wearing those white trousers again as the improved dad, which garners Miranda's praise once Daniel has learnt to cook and to clean. He's wearing a white shirt underneath his Mrs. Doubtfire outfit when he is about to go out and see his boss at the dinner. And there is a grey and white shirt that he wears when Miranda visits him on set. And that same grey and white shirt, now worn as a jacket, is seen when he comes to collect his children after the reconciliation. The second most prominent colour, seen 8 times, is blue. And here we see Daniel in a blue jacket when he moves in on his brother's apartment immediately after having been thrown out by Miranda. He's wearing a blue jacket and tie in court during the first court appearance when he's given weekend custody. where he has his kids visiting his apartment for the first time. He's wearing a primarily blue shirt. He is also wearing a much darker blue shirt on the very first call that he makes to Miranda, pretending to be an applicant for the housekeeper job. He is also wearing a darker blue shirt when he is undertaking his clerking duties at the studio, and a lighter blue one appears when he is learning to cook. He has a blue undershirt under his black jacket when he is disparaging the existing children's program to the studio boss. And finally, we see him in blue again when he's playing with the dinosaur figurines on the set of the children's show. Red occurs 6 times in this film as a costume color. At first, we see Daniel from the back wearing a mainly red shirt as he's undertaking his voiceover activities. He's also wearing a red shirt as he approaches the lady in the unemployment office looking for work. The most glaring red appears as bright red fingernails in one of the various different costume disguises that his brother creates for him. He's in a different red shirt this time for the improved dad effort. He's wearing a red jacket and tie for the dinner with his boss. And finally, a red undershirt when he comes to collect his children for after-school care. Brown also appears 6 times. Firstly, as a jacket and hat at the ill-fated birthday party for Chris, and also that same jacket appears at the unemployment office. When he applies for a new job at the studio, he's still wearing that same jacket. There is a different brown as a scarf in the second persona that we see being created by Daniel's brother, and he's wearing a brown jacket and trousers when he's applying to his boss's secretary to try and change the dinner appointment. And finally, of course, we see that same pair of brown trousers when he comes to collect his children towards the end of the film. A third colour that is seen the same number of times as red and brown is grey. Here, he's wearing a grey top when he's asked to leave home. He's also wearing grey trousers on one of his many phone calls to Miranda looking for that housekeeper job. The wig he wears for the second disguise that his brother creates for him is also grey. And as he works at his clerking job, he has grey trousers. His jacket for his second court appearance is also grey, and when Miranda visits him on set, he's wearing grey trousers as well as a grey and white shirt. Coming in as a costume colour only 4 times, we see Daniel with a black patterned shirt talking about what he needs to do with his new job. He wears that same black shirt on another of his fake calls to Miranda, and there is a prominent black wig in one of the other personas that is created by Daniel's brother for him. And the final appearance of that black shirt occurs when he is disparaging the existing children's program to studio boss. A little less regularly than black is pink. It's seen as the top in this particular disguise, and also the same top for a different disguise as Daniel's brother tries to create a new persona for him. He's also wearing pink patterned shorts when he's learning to cook. Orange appears as the wig in one of the personas, and also as the shirt and tie that Daniel wears to court on the final appearance before he loses custody of his children. So what can we learn from Daniel's colours? Well, firstly, white, the most prominent colour, has to do with dealing with novel experiences. Blue appears when he's working to overcome some sort of disappointment, and red when he's demonstrating playfulness, obstinacy, or an attempt at dominance or success in some endeavour. Brown occurs when he's using his existing skills to manipulate novel experiences, and also when he's in the position of supplicant. Grey indicates a loss of esteem and the acceptance of the consequences of that loss. With black, we're dealing with disguise. It's either his disguise or it's the disguise of others. Pink is all about fake it till you make it, and orange is all about desperation. So let's now move on to Mrs. Doubtfire's colours. Just like Daniel, the most prominent colour for Mrs. Doubtfire's costumes is white. And the first white we see on her is her face covered in white cream to disguise the look of her face when she is entertaining the social worker who is checking out Daniel's apartment. In this scene, she is pretending to be Daniel's sister. Mrs. D wears white while she's making her first attempt at cooking, and as you can see from the blazing blouse, she has made a hash of it. She also wears a white shirt when she does house cleaning, and as an apron when she has finally learnt how to cook a lobster. There is a white cardigan which appears as part of a sequence of scenes where time is indicated as passing, because we don't see very much happening, but just different costumes and different locations. She's also wearing white when the children discover that she is indeed Daniel. In the kitchen, where she sabotages Stu's meal, she's wearing a white overall. On her television show, she is seen in a white cardigan and a grey, brown and white skirt. Finally, that white cardigan appears as a cardigan and skirt when Daniel's persona, Mrs. D, is being congratulated by the studio boss for the popular show that has been produced. Quite a way behind white is grey. Grey appears 6 times. Firstly, as a skirt when Mrs. Doubtfire meets children for the first time. Also as the blouse during the lobster cooking scene. It's one of the blouses seen in the time passing sequence as both blouse but also as a skirt. That skirt appears again when invited to Miranda's birthday party, and grey appears as a dress this time when the actual dinner party is underway. And of course we have that grey blouse appear once again at the studio where the boss is congratulating Daniel on his performance. Blue also appears fairly regularly on Mrs. Doubtfire's costumes. Firstly, as a jacket that she wears on first meeting Miranda, and later on as a dressing gown in Daniel's apartment as she rushes backwards and forwards between identities in order to impress the social worker. There is a blue apron worn for the house cleaning scenes, and a blue blouse occurs when she is meeting Stu for the first time at Miranda's house. That same blouse also appears on the occasion where she's helping Miranda to choose a dress for her birthday dinner. Pink is the first colour that we actually see Mrs. Doubtfire in, although at this stage we don't see Mrs. Doubtfire's face. This is the culmination of the work done by Daniel's brother and his partner, and later on we see it as the covering over the burnt blouse when Mrs. Doubtfire presents the dinner that she has bought and pretended to cook for Miranda and the family. A darker pink cardigan appears in one of the time-passing sequences, and there is also a great deal of pink in the skirt that she wears in another of the time-passing sequences. Red occurs as a patterned skirt in the confrontation with the children on Mrs. Doubtfire's first foray into managing them. It also is worn in the housekeeping dance, and later on we see red as the prominent colour in the dress that Mrs. Doubtfire wears to the spa resort. Interestingly, that red patterned dress is also echoed in Miranda's clothing. This happens a number of times in the film where Miranda's clothing colours and those of Mrs. Doubtfire coincide. A colour that appears rather rarely for Mrs. Doubtfire is brown. Here we have brown as the handbag, but it also features prominently on the patterned blouse when Mrs. Doubtfire first appears at Miranda's door. And it's also the coat that Mrs. Doubtfire wears when Miranda apologizes to her for her rudeness. A very muted purple appears as a cardigan for Mrs. Doubtfire when she's listening to Miranda's confession about how she and Daniel were unable to get on. There is a much darker purple as a jacket that she wears over her grey dress at the birthday dinner. The blouse for the initial meeting consists of orange, brown, and grey, and this gives an overall pinky orange effect to the blouse. Similarly, the black, white, and pink patterned blouse that Mrs. D wears during Miranda's confessional scene is one that is overwhelmingly black, and so we'll classify it as that. But it's the only time that Mrs. Doubtfire wears black. Now, a couple of times we see Mrs. Doubtfire in a nude-coloured outfit. This is her bodysuit, and although it's not specifically a colour as such that I normally would look at, I've included it here because it does form a major part of two sections of these back and forth Daniel to Mrs. Doubtfire persona transitions. This first one occurs in Daniel's apartment to try and fool the social worker, and the second one is in the bathrooms at the restaurant where Daniel and Mrs. Doubtfire are jumping backwards and forwards as personas so that she can attend both the studio boss's dinner and also the birthday dinner for Miranda. So what have we learnt from Mrs. Doubtfire's colours? Well, white is all about subterfuge. It's about hiding her true identity and also hiding her motives. Grey is all about ulterior motives, gathering and planting of information. And blue is about creating an impression of reliability, whereas pink is creating an impression of likability as well as innocence. Red, which appears rarely, is all about the display of dominance and dealing with resentment. Brown shows an impression of being a sensible sort of person and no-nonsense creation. Purple is about keeping secrets, and orange about testing the penetrability of the disguise. Can people be fooled? Finally, black is all about absorbing of vital information. And then we have the nude body. This is a comedic dig at female attire generally. And as such, we hear part of the script alluding to those very same ideas. So let's quickly examine the overall colour information that this film allows us to look at. Firstly, I've gathered them together in frequency because the frequency develops the level of importance that those colours add to the plot. Daniel's frequencies go from white to blue to red to brown to grey to black to pink and then orange. For Mrs. Doubtfire, it's also white as the most prominent colour, but then it goes grey, blue, pink, red, brown, purple, orange, black, and of course we have those two nude sequences as well. Both Daniel and Mrs. Doubtfire predominate in white and blue. Daniel's next most prominent colours are red, brown, and grey, whereas Mrs. Doubtfire's are grey, pink, and red. Both of them have nude scenes. Daniel as an actual body, Mrs. Doubtfire as a fake body. In terms of the colours that they do not share, only Mrs. Doubtfire has purple in her costume repertoire. So what have we learnt overall? There is a limit to the most prominent colours for both Daniel and Mrs. Doubtfire. White is all about novelty and disguise. Blue is about working hard to prove a point. Grey is reacting to the loss or change in status. And brown is using existing skills to impress significant others. Red is domination in a situation. All the other colours appear so rarely that it is difficult to give a comparison between the two. So there you have it. That's the colour analysis of Mrs. Doubtfire. My next film is going to be one that was suggested by one of you. It's a film I haven't seen before, but I have managed to acquire a copy of it, which is not an easy task since I require it in brand new DVD format. And this is because of the way in which I process the films in order to analyse them. Certainly, I hope you'll be with me for that one. It'll come up in about a month's time. Until then, enjoy your life.